Well, so good to have you all here today. Thank you. This is the fourth session in our four-part series this semester, where we are kind of walking through some of the basics around teaching and learning, some of the core things that you'll be thinking about as future faculty members. And today we're going to be thinking about the idea of engagement and a phrase you might have heard being tossed around, active learning in college classrooms. For those of you I haven't had the chance to meet yet, my name is Erin Hager. I work in our Faculty Center for Teaching and Learning, and I manage our professional development. And part of that is the CERTLE initiative that you're all a part of here today. So welcome, welcome. Today, what I'm hoping we're able to collectively walk away with is the ability to explain the relationship between active learning strategies and general picture of student engagement, right? And kind of its connection to what we know about teaching and learning, what we know about students' ability to retain information, based on how actively they are engaged in that learning process. And that's probably something you all can attest to as students as well, which we will talk about. In addition, I hope that each of you are able to describe a few active learning strategies and think about their level of complexity, specifically with respect to the complexity it would take you as a faculty member to organize that activity. We're going to talk about a few active learning strategies at various levels of complexity. And then finally, I'm hoping that we're able to apply that information. And I've got a few course scenarios where I'm hoping we can brainstorm ways that a faculty member teaching those topics might be able to increase the student engagement in that course. Are there any questions about where we're headed or any other thoughts before we dive in? Please feel free to unmute because I can't see all of the, if there's any hand signals. No? Okay. Well, let's start just real quickly with a brief history of this phrase active learning. We hear it a lot in higher education now, but we didn't always. We've always known, researchers have always known that learning isn't a passive process. In fact, educators, as you know, as far back as John Dewey in 1915, made statements like this: "No book or map is a substitute for personal experience." Right? We need to do the thing that we're trying to learn. But in the sphere of higher education, we didn't really hear a lot about the need for students to be an active participant in their learning really until about the 80s or 90s, when it started to become more of a mainstream thought. We have a quote from two scholars in the late 80s: "Students must talk about what they're learning, write about it, relate it to past experiences, and apply it to their daily lives." And this feels kind of common sense, but when we think about the way higher education faculty members are typically taught themselves, we're seeing this continuation. We have seen this continuation of the lecture approach, and it really has been revolutionary. I would say within the last 30 or 40 years, the efforts to complement that approach with some strategies that engage the students a little bit more. And then here we've got what I consider to be one of the most succinct and to the point definitions of active learning. Basically, they are instructional strategies that involve students in doing things and thinking about what they are doing, right? And that's the gist of what we're going to be covering here today. Now, one of the consequences of thinking about active learning in terms of strategies alone is that we can lose the forest for the trees a little bit. And I don't know if anybody else here on the call loves cooking shows and reading cookbooks and all things cooking, but I certainly do. And so the analogy that I've come up with is that individual strategies, kind of having a toolbox or a pantry of ingredients, things that we can do in the classroom, that's really great. But it's kind of the equivalent of thinking about ingredients outside the context of preparing a meal, right? So we don't just want to think about these strategies in isolation, just looking at what we have in the pantry and seeing each one of those things individually. We really want to think about, what are we trying to put together as far as the student learning experience is concerned. How can we take all of these strategies, combine them with other approaches like lectures, like resources, like videos, so that we're creating a meal where we're getting to a more holistic and engaged experience for the student? And so what I really like to think about is the individual strategies are leading to this culture of what I'm going to call engagement, right? So we're really thinking about over the course of an instructional unit, over the course of the course itself, how are students engaging with the content, right? We're going to talk a little bit about what that means. Going back to the food analogy, there is a chef and a famous cookbook author named Samin Nosrat, and she wrote this James Beard award-winning cookbook that really lays out the principles of what she calls good cooking, and they have these components in common, whatever they might be, however she's going to combine them, they're really kind of the core of what makes something delicious, and that's salt, fat, acid, and heat. So that kind of got me thinking, well, what are the same ingredients, so to speak, when we're thinking about student engagement? What are the kinds of things that we want to go back to and ask ourselves all the time? Do we have this included in our instruction? And when I was thinking about it, I came up with these four things, right? So the teaching and learning equivalent of salt, fat, acid, heat is the opportunity to practice what they're learning, the opportunity to collaborate with others, to share ideas, to get feedback, to bounce things off, to create that social connection, the opportunity to hear feedback and to incorporate that feedback into revision, and then the opportunity to reflect both on the content and their process as learners. So I think that within any instructional time frame that we're talking about, whether it's a week of class or a unit of instruction, an entire course, if instructors are constantly asking themselves whether or not students have opportunities to do these four things, then we're making a lot of progress towards creating that culture of engagement. Are there any questions about this so far? No? Okay. So when we think about this idea of engagement, just want to clarify that that doesn't necessarily mean engagement just with you as a professor, as an instructor. There are different kinds of ways that we can engage, right? If we have our little girl in pigtails here representing the student can engage with the instructor for sure. The student is also engaging with the content. What are they reading? What are they watching? What kind of assignments are they doing? And then students can also engage with fellow students, with peers in the class, right? So those are kind of the outlets for them to be able to try some of those four things, right? The practice, the collaboration, the feedback, and the reflection. So what I'd like to do now is just give you an opportunity to think about your disciplines, think about your fields, and just feel free to unmic. I'd like to hear what you think professionals in your field, what kind of skills and behaviors do engaged professionals in your discipline demonstrate? If you're in a health profession, what do practicing health professionals need to be able to do, right? How do they engage with their field? If you are in law or social work, what kinds of things are folks doing in that field? And then the most important part of this question for our purpose today, how have your instructors created opportunities for you to engage, to practice these kinds of skills, to get feedback on them during a learning experience?
I can begin. In my field, in typically in the sciences, for our classes, there's a lecture component, but also a lab. And so
Mhm.
the students will need to learn how to carry out certain lab techniques. And so that's kind of like their space in order to actually get hands-on experience with those actual techniques.
Yeah, yeah, exactly right. So a lab is a perfect example of a place where that kind of engagement is happening. So Brianna, let me ask you, with respect to labs, how do students get feedback on their lab skills? How do they collaborate with others? Does it kind of do that salt, fat, acid, heat? Uh, does it cover those bases?
Yeah, so throughout the semester, they'll typically have lab experiments they'll carry out, and they'll have to submit assignments that kind of answer questions on their performance in those actual experiments. But then also at the end of the lab, they'll have a practical. Well, they'll actually have to physically carry out the technique, and we kind of watch them and score them on their performance.
Okay. Okay. That's great. Thank you for sharing that. Thoughts from other folks, either fellow scientists or few folks in the law school, social work, health professions? Yeah.
So to add to what Brianna said, you also get the feedback of knowing whether or not an experiment works, right? Because they're built-in controls. And
Yes.
so, and those can be addressed if it's like a technique issue or, reagent issue, but you get sort of instant feedback in that respect. And then the other thing we do as professionals is engage, because we have knowledge about our area of expertise, but if we're trying to learn something new or branch out, you reach out to somebody, you reach out to fellow experts, right? If they're an expert in something else. So learning to collaborate and work in groups to share knowledge.
Yeah, that's great. So that's an excellent point. I think it's easy for students to think, particularly when you think about your freshman biology, class of students there. They may think that what's in this course or what's in the field, it's all been everything's already been discovered, right? Everything's already been done. So how can you model? How can you get students to practice this idea of going beyond what's already known? What ways might a faculty member have students practice that?
In a 101 lab that I was a part of, the idea was by the end of the semester, you've built up a little toolbox of some skills. And so the last lab was to kind of apply, like the lab was, here's a problem and you decide how to solve it. The instructor gave no specific guidance, but it was a problem of such a quality that you could probably see if you'd been paying attention. Oh yeah, we know how to solve all the steps of this because we've done A, B, and C labs. So it's sort of like it's curated. It's not like a totally open-ended problem, but it's also not like most labs where every step has already been written down. The students still had to kind of realize, oh yeah, I've done this kind of experiment before, and then
yes. So they're extrapolating based on things that they've already known, they've already experienced, applying it to a new situation rather than following lab instructions like a recipe, right? To keep the cooking metaphor going on. Yeah, that's a great way to get them thinking independently and thinking in that scientific way, right? It's easy to miscommunicate that science isn't creative, right? Because if you're at that level, all you're doing is following instructions and seeing what happens. Yeah, that's a wonderful example. Thanks for sharing that. Any other thoughts here about how you as a professional in your field will engage with it and how we can translate that to students?
Yeah, I had another thought.
Yeah.
I guess you already know that I'm a scientist, but another way that professional scientists engage with the field is through reading, articles and thinking about them, reflecting about what's already known, thinking about what still needs to be learned and how our skills can help address that gap. And then we get practice and feedback in that kind of engagement with written down knowledge by writing knowledge down ourselves and then submitting it to peers, and they directly give feedback. Hey, this didn't work. You need to try again or something. So that's kind of a different way. And the students can practice like in a 101 level. It's probably just you write a mini report on your lab, what happened that week in lab, and you get some feedback. But as the student gets maybe more towards the level of an upper level graduate, are undergraduate or even a graduate student, they can actually maybe do a literature review or conduct their own kind of mini project and write a genuine research article, even if it doesn't get published.
Yeah, yeah, they can model that that practice. And Eric, what I really appreciate about what you're saying is that, sometimes students just use that 101 example. They think that these are hoops that they are going through just to get through the class and just to get that letter grade at the end. And they may not make the connection that this is what professionals in the field are doing as well at a different level. So, writing a lab report is not just showing me you understand these techniques or that you did the lab or reflected on the lab appropriately, but this is how we communicate. This is how we get feedback on our practice of science, right? To see themselves as a player in the bigger picture of how science works rather than just doing something for the grade. Yeah, that's great. Well, thank you all for sharing that. I'm sure in your own experiences as learners, you've had lots of opportunities to practice engaging. We're going to talk about some other concrete strategies, but I always like to ground it in the professional worlds where you find yourselves now. So on this next slide, you don't have to read all of these, but the idea here is that there are active learning techniques that we can integrate into our classrooms that have varying levels of complexity, ranging from the very simple down here on the bottom left, all the way up to more complex types of active learning strategies or teaching strategies. And when we're talking about complexity, I want to make it clear that on this slide, we're talking about complexity as it relates to what the faculty members have to do to implement this kind of activity in the classroom. An activity that is down here on the very simple level may involve complex thinking and complex reasoning on the part of the student. But what we're talking about here with simple is that it doesn't take a heavy lift of a faculty member to put this into practice. The more complex strategies are ones that might take a little bit more long-term thinking, planning at the semester level, that kind of thing. But there are things that you can integrate into your classes tomorrow if you're teaching or TAing that can really provide students with a wonderful opportunity to reflect on what they're learning, to practice skills, to get feedback, all those things that are logistically very simple for you to implement as an instructor. So I just want to go through a couple of examples, kind of in that low, medium, and high range of complexity. So starting with the more simple activities, low level, the first one we're going to talk about is an activity called the muddiest point. Has anyone ever experienced this as a student? It's so easy. Literally, after you give, let's say you deliver a lecture or the students are working through a unit, you give them an opportunity, 2 minutes, 2.5 minutes, to write down something that is still muddy for them. What is a question that you still have about this material after today's lecture? After you've done the lab, what's something that still doesn't make sense to you? And what this is doing, it's getting students to reflect on their own learning. So what they expected to learn, where they are, and where the gap is. So it's some metacognition that's going on as well. The bonus of this is that when you collect these responses, and they can be anonymous, right? So some faculty members, it's as simple as handing out an index card, asking students to write it down on a scrap of paper, sending you an email, whatever. You are looking holistically at the class, and you're not looking for any one student. This isn't graded, but you're getting a sense. Like, I'm flipping through these index cards and I've got 15 questions that are related to this, right? And that gives you some feedback that maybe that's a topic you want to revisit. Maybe you want to point your students to some additional resources if you feel like it's already been teached out. But you can look at it proportionally and say, wow, this many people are still stuck on this. I'm going to make a particular decision here with respect to my teaching. Very impactful, super easy to implement. The next one I want to talk about at this level is something called a think, pair, share. Has anyone done something like this in class? Does this look familiar? Yeah, this has gained a lot of traction over the last few years. So the idea here is the faculty member has gone through part of their presentation, part of their lecture, part of the class, and they're going to pose a question, a thoughtful, thought-provoking type of question. And the first phase of this activity, and it's hard as a faculty member to do, but it is to let the students individually on their own just think about it for a minute or a minute and a half, 2 minutes. That's really hard. That's a long time when you're standing up in a classroom not saying anything. But when you think about it from a student's point of view, it's really not that much time to get them to start processing their answer. Now, the point of this is so that you are not just rewarding the first student who has their hand up, you're giving every student that quiet space to reflect and ponder the question. Once they've had that individual time, you just put them up in pairs and you ask them to compare their responses with each other. So each of them has the opportunity to explain their thought process to at least one other person. They do that, they exchange. And then as a whole class, there may be a few people, a few pairs who want to share what they have come up with as a duo. The nice thing about sharing in this way is that it takes the pressure off any one student, right? If the duo responds as a pair, you know, our group came up with this, it's less intimidating than maybe one student raising their hand. They've had a chance to go back and forth with somebody. That can be a very impactful way to get students to engage with the material that they've had. Any questions about those two approaches? All told, these could take less than 5 minutes in a class, but could really provide some solid engagement and inviting the students to connect with the material. Good. All right, so here's a couple more in that low level bucket. This is a role play or dialogue. And some of you may be looking at me like, oh, I work in the sciences. There's no way we could do this. So I'll tell you a few examples of how this can work. You may put students in pairs and ask them to role play or have a dialogue from the point of view of two particular scientists who maybe had different ways of approaching the same kind of problem. I've heard other people use this activity where the people doing the dialogue are two different theories that could explain the same behavior. There are two different theories that could explain the same phenomenon. So you're just asking them to speak from the point of view of that particular theory. The idea here is that students are adopting a persona, responding to a prompt or a thought question from the point of view of that persona, and practicing articulating some of those ideas out loud with a partner. Any questions about that? Has anybody done anything like that in their undergrad or here? No. You as a faculty member just need to think about who is doing the dialogue, right? What roles are you going to be assigning? This could be if someone here is from the School of Law, this could be, you know, maybe you're learning about a particular case, and then you're presenting a new piece of evidence or a new legal theory, and you're asking people from a particular case to talk about that from their point of view. Social work, the possibilities are endless, right? Thinking about different client interactions, different agencies you might be working with, different federal organizations, that kind of thing. So low level complexity, you just need to think about who are these roles? Who are they going to play? Another low level complexity at the end of an instructional unit or a big, you know, a chunk of your course, you might ask them to provide you with some test questions and answers. You might ask them to come up with 10 multiple choice answers, 2 essays, that kind of thing, and answer them. The good thing for the students in this activity is they're starting to think, what were the most important things that we covered? What might show up on a test? How might the instructor phrase this? What should I be reinforcing with myself? So that gives students a chance to go back and think reflectively over, you know, a particular period of time in the course. Some instructors give incentives, you know, I'm going to use some of these if they're well written and they tap into that. Others combine them all and give them to the students for a study packet. There's lots of ways that you could collect this, but it could also become an activity in itself once students are looking at other people's questions, once you've vetted them. So low level complexity does not require a lot of planning, does not require a lot of room arrangement or anything like that. So pretty simple and can be high impact. So now if we step it up a notch, let's think about some mid-level complexity here. The first one I'd like to talk about is a jigsaw activity. Has anyone done something like this? Does this name ring a bell for anybody? I see Eric nodding. Do you want to explain how that worked and then I'll kind of fill in?
I think anyway. Um, the thing that I did was you have a completed jigsaw or something that has like a set of cards that have some relationship, and then you hand them out one at a time so every student kind of has connected pieces. And then now that I've got my piece, I need to go around the room and have little interactions with a bunch of people to try to find who am I supposed to be connected to. So it's a way
Oh,
to get people milling around and thinking about whatever it is the relationships are between the different.
oh, interesting. Okay, so you've got, say, like a scientific principle on your piece, and you're walking around saying, who do you connect with? And then once you've got your group, you're trying to figure out what do we have in common, or why are we connected? That is a very cool
Yeah.
activity. It's a little different than the one I'm going to describe, but that is really neat also because you're asking them to look for patterns, to look for similarities, to look for creative connections between those ideas or concepts on the back of their jigsaw. That is very cool. The jigsaw that I'm going to describe here is kind of this idea of dividing students into expert groups and then having them gain expertise in a particular area and then reshuffling the groups so that different people can share. They've all come together with their expertise and now they're sharing collectively. So the way that it works is that you start in one group, and so this works well for topics where the information is not sequential. So let's give an example here. Let's say you're looking at um, 3 different agencies and how they respond to a particular social crisis, right? So you're going to get in these groups and it's decided student A is going to look at the Department of Housing, student B is going to look at a state agency, student C is going to look at a nonprofit. Then they separate and they become experts in the piece that they've been assigned. And they're going to go through and they're going to learn it enough. They're going to have some guided questions so that they can come back to that group with that expertise and share it collectively, right? And one of the ways that they do that is they read the information on their own, but then they're put into expert groups. So everyone looking at the federal agency is going to sit together and they're going to tackle these questions together and they're going to become experts in that as a unit. And then they're going to reshuffle back into their original groups and bring that expertise back and share it again. So it's really good for information, like I said, that does not need to be taught in a sequential way where they can kind of separate, build that expertise, and then bring it back to each other. Any questions about that? So that takes a little bit of thinking on the part of the professor, right? What are the expert groups that I want? Can they become experts without the information of the other members in the group to start with? What resources am I providing them? How are they going to work together in their expert groups? And what are they going to come back and share and do with that information? So that's a different kind of jigsaw, but I really like Eric's example as well. So the other one I want to talk about at this level here is just this idea of polling, right? You guys have probably done that, the Slidos and the those kinds of things where a professor might have some questions built into the polling software in advance, which can be a great way to check understanding, to get the opinion of a group of students anonymously in a class. You can kind of check the pulse of where the class is. To get feedback on their instruction. And the reason I put this here in mid-level, it's very easy for the students to do. But it does take a little bit of working with that software ahead of time so that at the appropriate points in your presentation, you can bring up these polls and have students engage with that information. Not hard, it just takes a little bit of planning. Any questions about this? Has it gotten, I'm curious, from your point of view as students, would you say that polling is commonly used among your faculty members using these kinds of software? Is this something that's gotten a little bit integrated into your learning experience as a student? Yeah, widely used, says Aman. Pretty common. Is it getting to the point where you kind of roll your eyes when another one comes out, or can you see, is, you know, does it feel valuable, or does it depend on how the faculty members using it?
When I've used it, I've found it's very useful because it keeps the class engaged. Because, you know, like
Mhm.
if you're just like talking at them for 50 minutes, sometimes they can start to kind of zone out. But when you have I like to intersperse it throughout the talk, kind of to cover
Yeah.
information we may have just like covered in the PowerPoint. So it keeps them on their toes a bit.
Yeah, yeah, they have to go into that kind of immediate recall, which primes them, right, to know that they, you know, what they should be paying attention to, or just that they should be paying attention, right? And that, yeah, it does. It keeps them on their toes, like you said. Another thing that, you know, could be considered mid or high level complexity for folks in the health professions, you know, this idea of simulation, right? The chance to work with a standardized patient or with a mannequin, you know, in the law professions to maybe work with a standardized client. Um, you know, so the idea here on the part of the faculty member is to really think about what needs to be included in that simulation, what kind of materials are needed ahead of time, what kinds of questions are you expecting, and how are you going to be evaluating that simulation experience. But that's a very common one that we see at campuses like ours. So you know, one thing too I have noticed is, has anyone ever done that poverty simulation that's done by the Office of Student Affairs? We think about simulation a lot in the health professions, but there was one experience that had it's like a 3-hour event where you are kind of operating as though you need to survive on within a particular context, and you're given a certain amount of money and you have a certain amount of things you have to buy, and you know, people who work have to go, they can't earn money during those hours anyway. There's just a lot of complexity to it, and you really feel the stress of making those day-to-day decisions, you know, when resources are scarce. So simulation, the point here is, it does not have to be limited to medical and health professions. They can be very impactful in other disciplines as well. So some high level complexities. These are things when you get, you know, some years of being a faculty member under your belt, you might be integrating into your classes. So there's an approach called team-based learning. And I'm wondering if anyone here, I'm going to describe it and then you can tell me if any of your courses have used this structure. On the surface, this sounds just like breaking students out into groups and having them do some things. It's actually much, much more complex. True team-based learning puts students into teams at the beginning of the semester, and it becomes the main teaching strategy throughout the entire course. And the teams follow a particular sequence. On the first part of the sequence is that every member of the team needs to read and absorb and engage with the material individually so that they can effectively contribute to the team. And so they're given an individual test to make sure that they can hold up their end of the bargain, and that they have accountability to the team. So they take that individual test. Then as a team, the group takes the exact same test. And this time they can talk about their answers. They can share, you know, what they said, why they think it's A instead of B, et cetera, et cetera. They get a team score for that test. And then that ensures that the team as a collective is ready to tackle whatever the problem is, whatever the situation is that they're going to be exploring. So that ensures their readiness to tackle a more advanced application type problem. They use that information to work toward an answer. Maybe they're given a scenario, they're given some kind of project to do that applies all of the information that they have been given. And the instructor can come in and give some targeted supportive lectures, but it really flips the responsibility of the learning during class period onto the students. The instructor sort of sets the stage by having the questions thought in advance, the activity they're doing in advance, what resources they need, but it's very, very student focused and student oriented. So that's team-based learning. Another high level complexity is this idea of service learning. And that's a very robust teaching approach that involves using community engagement principles to meet your course objective. So it's more than just, say, bringing your students to the food bank, you know, for one afternoon to do a volunteer project together. It's much more comprehensive than that. It's really about building community partnerships, coordinating the kind of work that your students are doing, so that when they reflect on that work, they are demonstrating an understanding of the course principles. And it's complex because, as you can imagine, the faculty members need to have those community relationships to start with. They need to coordinate the work. They're probably jumping through some hoops in terms of, permissions to go off campus and arranging all of those kinds of things. But it can be really, really powerful. And definitely something I would just put on your radar for ways you might be thinking about creating that level of engagement with your students later on. Questions about any of those strategies? Have any of you experienced ones that we described or anything like it? Nothing coming to mind? All right. Well, why don't we do a little practice exercise then? I'm going to show some scenarios here. And I would just like you to think about them and just unmute and tell me what opportunities you might consider to provide engagement opportunities for the students in these courses. So let's start with the first one. Let's imagine a human anatomy class where they're learning about the cardiovascular system. These are the objectives here. They're going to describe the structure of the heart and its position, etc. They're going to outline the differences between these particular parts of the heart. What might be some ideas of ways to engage students in a lesson like this?
I actually had a lab like this, and one of the activities they did was actually cut open a sheep heart and look at the different parts of the heart in a lab. So that's one way for them to visually and kinesthetically, I think that's the word, to have like a hands-on touch approach in order for learning.
Yeah. So on the faculty member side, that might go into that more complex or more medium level complexity, because you have to arrange for all those materials and make sure they know how to do the dissection and all of that. But what a way to crystallize that information of here's where all these things are in this heart and compare it to the human. That's great. Any other ideas? What could be a way that we could do this that didn't involve scalpels, sharp instruments?
You could
Yeah,
probably
Andrea.
find a simulation of this.
Tell me what you're thinking. Yeah.
I said you could probably find a simulation of it.
Like watching someone else
Let's
do.
do it. Mm-hmm.
Okay. So not having them dissect themselves, but showing it. Yeah. What other ideas? Anyone have like a really simple way you could do this? It could be as simple just having them draw it, right? Like you give a lecture and maybe you have some slides where you're demonstrating it, you're asking them to draw it, or you're giving them a drawing and asking them to label parts based on what they've already learned. They could do a jigsaw maybe for the second one, where maybe they become experts independently on one group is for arteries, one group is for veins, one group is for capillaries, etc. They become experts in those things and then mix up so that they can teach each other about the parts that they became expert on. And so everyone gets the benefit of that. So lots of different ways that you could tackle this. All right, let's see, what's the next one? Okay, what about a statistics course? Looking at measures of central tendency, computing mean from raw data, talking about outliers. How could you get students engaged in a lesson like this? Maybe during that class period, not just giving them problem sets and practice problems for homework, but what could they do in class?
This seems like an easy one, like that you could have in class activity, because you can have people generating data based on themselves. Like, you're just sort of asking people to do something, and they're they're calling out what their results were or what their height is or whatever the case, whatever the data is. And we're entering that into some kind of spreadsheet that everyone can kind of see and watching how the distribution changes. And
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, right. And you in real time, you could say like, all right, so Sarah's over here is 6'2". What happens when we take her data out of this? How does that affect the thing? Yeah. And it's personalized, right? So that they can see like, oh wow, we're like you said, we're watching this in real time. That's a cool idea. Any other suggestions? We didn't cover this one, but one of the oh, sorry about this. I don't know if you're seeing that. Getting a little error message here. One of the ones on that where we saw the line going up from simple to complex is this idea called documented problem solving. And really what this is giving students a problem, a computation to do. And on their paper, on one side of the paper, they're actually doing the computation. And on the other half of the paper, for each step, they're explaining to you why. And so that when you're looking at that, you can go through and not only see, what numbers they're using and how they're calculating them, but you see their thought process and they're having to articulate their thought process here. And that can be a really good opportunity for students to uncover assumptions that they thought they knew how to do this, but now they're being asked to explain it back to you. They realize they don't know how to get from step 2 to step 3, or they don't know what to do with this number once it comes out, right? So that can be a really good learning tool and a good feedback tool for you. If there are common areas where students are getting hung up, you can go back and demonstrate that problem, emphasizing those common areas. So that's something called documented problem solving. They're doing the math on one side, they're verbalizing what they're doing on the other, and then you can use that to sort of look under the hood of their mental process. All right, so here's the last one. Here we're going to go social science. So I took a course my senior year called The Experience of Homelessness, and we spent a good part of the first few class periods really getting granular about when is something considered a house, right? Like at what point can we say someone is housed or unhoused? And so the objectives here might be to look at discrepancies on how different organizations define homelessness, right? Like different social agencies may have a different criteria for what constitutes unhoused, and maybe to explain the impact of these discrepancies on people who are going through it. So what kinds of things, what kind of activities might you think of to do in a class like that? How could we not just lecture?
This might be a case where asking students to sort of represent different agencies and how they address homelessness or the unhoused. So it's from different perspectives.
Right. So adopting that the approach of one agency, maybe advocating it or role playing, pretend you're a representative of agency B. How are they going to answer this question? Absolutely. Any other ideas?
This might also be a good opportunity for a debate of some kind of maybe if you have them kind of not argue, but advocate for one or the other against each other to kind of facilitate that collective learning.
Yeah, exactly. And then they really have to get grounded in why would someone advocate for this, right? Like why, even if especially if they have to pick one they don't agree with. Yeah, that's such a good idea. And you think about the practicality of that, right, Brianna? Because, they could pretend they're on a city council, right? And they're having to advocate for one of these points of view. Like you could see those skills being used in real life. So it feels very meaningful and authentic to the students. That's a great idea. Any other thoughts?
Yeah, I have one.
Good.
It seems like the high level service learning method, I mean, it's high level, so I probably don't know all the details, but it seems like you could have the students almost spend part of their time in the course going to the Maryland, food bank. And so you have to, once you've spent a few days volunteering, just distributing food, you can write a paper or do some assessment based on that small aspect. But then the next week they have to spend time working with the administrators, and then the next week they have to spend time working with, that's a whole huge organization. And
Yeah.
also have to spend time talking to the individuals who are affected by, the patients or
The clients. Yeah,
clients. Yeah.
absolutely. Yeah. And what I appreciate about the way that you're thinking about it, Eric, is that I don't know if you've heard this term scaffolding, but the idea is kind of building experiences so that they're increasing in complexity, and using what students have already learned to inform what they're learning next. So if each of those interactions is getting a little bit more complex or abstract, or butting up against policy, butting up against the law, all those kinds of things, they're going to start to appreciate, it's a lot more complicated than just handing out cans of food, right? There's a lot more to it. That's really, really neat. You're right. That would take a lot. That would fall in that high complexity on the instructor's part. But what an amazing experience for those students to really get their hands in it that way. Another thought that came to my mind as you were talking, Eric, was, even just asking the students to go through the process of applying for certain kinds of aid, right? Just to understand, like, how complicated is it to submit this on a website? What would you have access to be able to fill out this form, to be able to prove XYZ about your situation, right? But to really give that lived experience of how complex these access to these services could be. It's fun. It's kind of fun to think about this as it's when you get into the habit of starting to think about your lessons as opportunities for engagement instead of what do I, the instructor, need to prepare, right? I know I need my PowerPoints. I know I need to create my quizzes. I know I need to think about assessment, all the things we've talked about up until now. But when you can go through that process and say, what could the students do that would really get their hands into this? What can the students do to really start practicing and experiencing the kinds of things that we're talking about? It can be incredibly creative. And it's one of my favorite parts about teaching. It's one of my favorite parts about working with faculty is brainstorming these kinds of things, because sometimes an idea comes up and they just can't wait to try that out in their own class. And it can be very impactful. Well, just real quick, I just wanted to just show you that there is evidence, right, that in the world of teaching and learning that shows that these kinds of activities, these kinds of active learning, engaged approaches really does impact learning. So talking about increased achievement, persistence, favorable attitudes towards learning. Another meta-analysis showing increased performance, statistically significant increases in student learning. This has been demonstrated again and again. So yes, it takes some thought. Yes, it takes some planning, but it makes a difference in what students can remember after the experience. And here are a few references so that we can send this out to you, or you can see it in the recording if you want to follow that up. Any questions or aha moments that you'd like to share for the good of the order?
I appreciated that there were more simple activities than high level complex.
Yeah, that does not have to be a brain bender on your part. Yep, absolutely.
Yeah, I was gonna say something similar, and I think that also helps maybe just having like a big tool bank of simple activities also might help it keep things fresh or engaging for students.
Yeah. And the more you do them, the more you kind of know the right moment to start pulling them out and, thinking about when you're planning a lesson, like, oh, this would be a good opportunity to do these. This would be a neat opportunity to do that. Feedback from your students, they'll tell you how it's going. I always found when I was teaching, when I would let my students know, I'm trying out a new activity today. I've never done this before. Let's see how it goes. 99 times out of 100, they will roll with it and play along and give you some good feedback at the end, how it could be better.